long as it's up there, I'll tell you what each. That's a picture of a German tank that was knocked out near one of our outposts. And those are dead Germans. That's St. Vith after it surrendered to the Germans and was bombed by the Air Force. Most of the damage was done. That's one of the streets. It was paved at one time, but German armor chewed it up, so the bombs didn't help. That's part of the Dragon's Teeth and Siegfried Line, myself and Sergeant Barsima on my right. That's me testing the light German machine gun. I wasn't firing it at anybody. And that was near the village of Hansfeld.
30 millimeter?
I think it was 9 millimeter, I'm not sure. It could have been 30.
No, it wasn't. You're right.
They had tapered shells. It might have started out being a 9 millimeter. That's just a chow line of one of the sections that I was in on the way back to we were retreating during the time that was taken. It was just a bombed out shell of a house. We were trying to take shelter. That's remnants of the 81st Engineer motor pool and some other sections that various people in there as we retreated towards the News River. That was
a little more volume.
Okay. That's me on top of a dead Tiger tank. I wasn't a Tiger, that was just a regular German light tank. That's the back end of a weapons carrier that showed all of our equipment and so forth. That's me on the left. I think the fellow's name on the right is Kaplan.
How old were you then, Lyt?
I was 19. That incident is not the LST that I went across the channel on. That boat was built to Nashville Bridge Company, and I worked there in the summer of 1941 in the blueprint room. I don't remember whether that was a minesweeper or a patrol boat or what. Maybe one of you Navy people recognize what it is. But they did build minesweepers and patrol boats here in Nashville. You can see across the river there. Okay. I've got kind of a convoluted subject, and I imagine the Battle of the Bulge is one reason not too many people here tonight. We've talked about it so many times in the past that, except for the new members that haven't heard, Frank Tucker and myself and George Thomas were all members of that division. So was Vaden Lackey's father, if any of you know Vaden. But I'm going to go back first into the 8th century and give you a little background on Lotharinia, which was part of the title of my talk for tonight. Lotharinia was a leftover from the Emperor Charlemagne, who was crowned by the Pope in the 8th century as emperor of that entire area that stretched from Holland in the north all the way to central Italy in the south, and from the Atlantic Ocean to what's now the Russian border with Germany on the east. It was the tradition of the Franks at that time, when an emperor died, to equally divide the empire amongst the male heirs in equal parts. But Charlemagne had promised the Pope. Incidentally, Charlemagne was still a heathen, and he preferred war, killing, and women, not necessarily in that category, but he did agree to become a Christian. Whether he ever became one, I don't know. But his eldest son was named Louis the Pious, and he made Louis promise to stay in control and not divide the kingdom while he was alive. The Pope, I assume, felt it was much easier to send Christianity people up there to colonize and go through one person where he had the control to let them in rather than try to go to each individual tribe and get their permission, I suppose. But at his death in 843, the three sons met in Verdun and signed a treaty, which was pretty historic at that time, in which the eastern part of the empire was divided to one of his sons, and the west to another, and the central part to the eldest son, whose name was Lothar. Thus the name Lothar was given to that section that includes the Ardennes Forest, the Siegfried Forest, and Siegfried Line area, and all the way from Holland down to the Swiss border. It was mainly occupied by farmers and woodcutters and some coal miners down in the Saar area. But that large landmass was actually the hugest landmass in Central Europe that had ever been controlled by one individual. And for over 1,000 years, the history of that unhappy frontier called Lothar could be compared to the workings of an accordion. When France was strong, which was most of the time, the pressure was inward. When Germany was strong, less frequently, the pressure was outward. In the second decade of our own country, the bloody migrations of one-time East and West Franks back and forth across the ancient kingdom of Lothar finally reached their climax. For 4 long years in World War I, Frenchmen and Germans died in the millions all along the frontier. Charlemagne's heritage in 1916 became a bloody struggle. The bloodbath of Verdun occurred, and on those same heights where Charlemagne had divided his kingdom, the French lost 350,000 men and the Germans 281,000 in an area less than 10 square miles. The battle for Verdun brought France to its knees. Mutinies followed, and for a whole year the French army was incapable of launching a major offensive. It was only through the efforts of Marshal Pétain, the defender of Verdun, who had been summoned from a Parisian brothel. I don't know where that information came from, but at the age of 69, he ought to be congratulated for that. The French army survived the shock. Verdun, where even today, on a wet, rainy day, poison gas seeps through the earth, and a true compass reading cannot be obtained because of the buried, rusted shells underground. Frenchmen who were going to determine the cause of events after World War I, André Maginot happened to be the Minister of Defense for France, and he advocated building elaborate Maginot Lines so that France would never have to suffer through a trench warfare again. André Maginot had lost a leg at Verdun, and he was a veteran, and he was a politician at the same time. The only one to question that the French should do that was an obscure lieutenant colonel, and his name was Charles de Gaulle. The Maginot Line was completed, and France depended on that line solely for its defense. De Gaulle advocated France build up an armored division, an armored attack force backed by motorized infantry to compete with any German breakthrough, which he claimed the Maginot Line could be breached at the Belgian border. indeed, when Hitler did make his attack, it was not only breached there, but Hitler came down through Holland, which was neutral at the time, and outflanked the Belgian army, which had to surrender, leaving the pocket at Dunkirk to its mercy. The only other two people to ever conquer Central Europe in the extent that Charlemagne had done, one was a Frenchman who really wasn't French. He was born in Corsica, and of course we know that was Napoleon Bonaparte. The other was Hitler, who wasn't a German, he was an Austrian, and both of those men, I guess, inherited Charlemagne's empire and then some. The unhappy frontier between France and Germany remained a place where the killing grounds were evidently kept open. You'll remember that the Siegfried Line was a bulwark for Hitler. He was able to have that line as a defense while he occupied Czechoslovakia and completed his capture of Poland. At that time, he tried peace overtures and failed at that. So he was able to withdraw most of his forces from the French border because he didn't really fear any attack at that time. That gave him protection where he wouldn't have a two-front war, and he could continue with the struggle with Russia, which he had started shortly after that.
Compare the difference between the Siegfried line and the Maginot Line. Maginot was quite complete.
The Maginot was an elaborate line. It had underground hospitals, it had underground ammunition dumps, it had heated barracks for the soldiers so they could live in comfort. And they not only lived in comfort, they died in comfort. But the Siegfried Line was built quite differently. Hitler considered himself one of the great builders of defensive lines. He had an engineer named Todt. Dr. Todt was an engineer, and Hitler turned over the construction of the Siegfried Line to Dr. Todt. I think over 14,000 strong points, much more Spartan than the French. They didn't have all those underground facilities, but they did have interlocking fire between the different posts that were defended by minefields and barbed wire, and they proved to be quite a barrier, as was exhibited in the Hurtgen Forest when 4 divisions were almost decimated trying to retake and take a couple of small towns and villages in the Hurtgen Forest that was defended very well by the Siegfried Line. And it cost the lives of many, many men. And the Germans also used it after the breakthrough in Normandy when they arrived at that area where with just a few troops they were able to hold the line there where we couldn't get through. And it proved costly every time we tried to take those fortifications. We lost a lot of men. Now, I guess we'll go back to the present. From the 8th century, we can jump into the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge might be the reason that we don't have so many people here tonight. We've heard it before, so I'm not going to go into too much detail except for the 106th Division. You've got printouts there from Colonel Riggs, who was my battalion commander. After the first and second day of the German attack, which occurred at 5:30 in the morning of December the 16th, and they opened up with railroad guns from the village of Prüm, which was just over the German border. And if you've ever been in an area where a 12-inch up to a 16-inch shell hits, it can really jolt you. I I must say that the first one hit in St. Vith. I was in the basement of the division headquarters at that time in the map room, and everybody that was there was afraid the whole building was going to collapse. It didn't. Fortunately, it did not strike the building. It struck in the street outside. The 106th Division had been deployed from England early in December of 1944. We went on LSTs and landed in the Le Havre estuary early one morning. We left England, and by nightfall we were trying to get out of the LST and get our equipment out. All of the French cranes and unloading equipment had been destroyed by the Germans when they retreated, and it was quite a job getting engineer equipment. Included bridging, it included heavy bulldozers and earth moving equipment of all sorts. They had to be loaded up on lowboys and readied for convoy. During that time, it rained almost every day. We were bivouacked in a mud field, I remember, and you pitch a pup tent, it was just useless. The water would run under it, and you were sleeping in mud. Those of us that had a vehicle on the road got into our vehicles and slept on top of duffel bags. I was one of the fortunate. After the first night in that mud hole, I got out and went into my truck and went to sleep. We finally, after about 3 days, got loaded up and began the motor march from the Thames, from the estuary there at the river, and crossed over into northern France and proceeded up through northern part of Belgium. And our positions were, we learned the day before we got there, in the Schneeifel range of the Ardennes forest there. If you look where he's got the little cursor going there, the 106th Division was right in that area, and the 99th Division was the division to our north. The 99th Division was not in the same corps that we were. Our corps headquarters were in Bastogne, and the 28th Division was our southern neighbor from the 106th Division. Our 3 regiments, 2 of which were in the old German fortifications of the Siegfried Line. It was a salient that had been taken by the 2nd Infantry Division, whose place we replaced the 2nd Infantry unit for unit. In fact, they took our new artillery guns, and we had to keep the ones that they'd been shooting, which some of them needed reboring. But at any rate, we established our defense line there as best we could. The Our River was to our rear, and we should have pulled back behind the Our River because it was a deep, swift-running river, and it would have given us protection against German armor if we had located our anti-tank guns and our artillery properly. But we didn't do that. On the first day of the attack, when those shells hit, they hit all of the headquarters of the various regiments. They hit the road junctions and severed communications. The only communications we had after that was just like a walkie-talkie, which didn't have much range. The correspondence between General Jones, our commanding officer of the division from St. Vith to Bastogne, was broken up and not really understood well. He understood the commander to say that was probably just a localized attack and wouldn't materialize into anything serious. So the division did not pull back those regiments, but left them where they were. Now, the Siegfried line that they occupied, the portals for firing a gun were on the wrong side of the bunkers, so they didn't do us any good at all. In fact, they handicapped us. As the second day evolved, and it was obvious that it was more than just a local attack, General Jones appointed my battalion commander, Colonel Riggs, as commander of the troops that were available to defend St. Vith. At that time, the road between St. Vith and a little town called Schönberg but Schönberg was about 5 miles from the Schneeifel area, and my company headquarters was in a little place called Huim, which is halfway between Schönberg and St. Vith. But the mapping section, of which I was a member of, had been pulled back to division headquarters. Fortunately for me, I only spent 2 days at Huim, and I spent those 2 days trying to dig a foxhole amongst a bunch of pine tree roots, which wasn't an easy job. The time I finished it, I had to move out. Couldn't take the foxhole with me, so anyway, I went to the map room there, and after the first barrage lifted, I was told to go ahead and take my map overlays out to the 423rd Infantry, and I was on my way from Schönberg on what's called the Skyline Drive at that time. It was a road that ran right behind the Schneeifel area there that was cut about 10 minutes after I got down the road. The Germans broke through and cut the road between Schönberg and where our vehicles were. They also made an attack between the 112th Regiment of the 28th Division and the 424th, which was our southernmost regiment. And through some means, they broke through the line of the 423rd and got into the road section in front of us. So we were trapped on that road. I guess there were 20 or 30 vehicles. We got out of our vehicles and formed a defense line behind the road bank as best we could. The Germans at that time that we could see were about 1,000 yards away. At 1,000 yards, if you fire your rifle at somebody, you can't really tell whether you hit them or not. So we tried to wait until they got closer, and by that time they had brought up an 88mm gun and started shelling us, and they also had our range with mortars, and with mortars popping around us, hitting several of the trucks. They sent up a Volkswagen with an officer in it with a white flag and talked to one of the officers that happened to be in one of the trucks there, and told us that if we didn't surrender, that they were going to let us have it. So he surrendered us, and we were marched into the woods about that time. It got us off the road so the armor could come on through. So that armored column on that Skyline Drive completely isolated the 423rd and 422nd Infantry regiments. So they were cut off, and they were also occupied by infiltrators who were trying to infiltrate their positions from the other side. that night, they took what prisoners they'd gotten on the road, and I guess they'd picked up some more because there was probably about 100 of us in one field. They marched us back past Schönberg and had put us in a farm field with barbed wires on 3 sides. It had a drainage ditch in the center of it. That night it began to snow, and they hadn't given us anything to eat or drink. Those of us that had canteens still had water, and they'd taken our weapons, of course, and what watches they could find, anything else of value. And anyway, the guards back and forth in the back of that area were pretty easy to time, and you could tell how long it took them to get from the drainage ditch to each corner of the field. And I watched them. As soon as they took off that way, I rolled over into that ditch, crawled down to the bottom of the ditch, got all full of mud and dirt, but that didn't matter. I crawled out underneath the cattle prods or wire that they had hanging down the back, and wasn't any trouble to get under them. And I continued crawling down that ditch till I got into the forest down below. And to make a long story short, I followed that ditch down till I got to a creek. By that time, it was so dark I wasn't making any progress at all, so I hid behind some logs and tried to avoid any German patrols that might appear. The next morning, when daylight came, I could tell where the shells were hitting, that the front was only about 5 to 6 miles away. So I made my way as best I could through the forest and avoided the road systems, because the Germans were coming through the roads and the Americans had roadblocks. They had brought up anti-tank crew that had been in St. Vith. They'd sent that up there and protected that road from Schönberg. And the 168th Engineer and the 81st Engineer Battalion, what was left of it, Colonel Riggs had put in that defense perimeter. And by the time I got there late in the afternoon of the 17th, I was able to identify myself, and they let me come forward with my hands up, and I got back to my unit in St. Vith. At that time, the division headquarters, General Jones had decided to move the headquarters back to Vilsheim, which was a road junction to the west, about 10 to 12 miles away. And the night of the 17th, I was in my section, and we were ordered to load up our drafting equipment and all of our survey equipment and get out on the road and try to get to Vilsheim. We got to Vilsheim, and we could hear artillery fire even beyond it. And the MPs there just motioned us on and said, continue on to La Roche. La Roche was a town right off the hillside. As you come into the Ardennes, you go up a hillside, and this was at the lower end of the hillside. We could see tank battles going on to our right. Part of Pfeiffer's armored column had broken through there, and there were shining lights up in the clouds which reflected back onto the American tanks and silhouetted them for the German gunners, and it wasn't long before they knocked out all the Shermans that were firing at them. We continued on all the way to Marseille at the Meuse River before we finally stopped. There, we found British troops who had been moved down there by Montgomery to back up the front in case the Germans ever got there. It back to St. Vith, Colonel Riggs was still there, and they were expecting the 6th and 9th Armored combat units to come in and relieve them. General Jones had requested them before he ever moved his headquarters to relieve the 2 regiments in the Schneeifel. But as those 2 armored columns came down from the north, the roads they were traversing happened to cut the roads that the German armored column was on. So the whole division never reached us. Only 3 or 4 troops of each division arrived, and they were immediately put into the defense of St. Vith. And a Lieutenant Colonel Fuller, who was one of the combat commanders, took over from Colonel Riggs. If you read that article that I left you for Colonel Riggs, he objected to that being left there in defense of St. Vith, and the armored people had just arrived and really didn't know the situation. And on the following night, those armored columns were moved back to consolidate far to the west without notifying Colonel Riggs that they were moving. At that time, St. Vith was just about surrounded. The 424th Regiment of the 106th Division had pulled back, as had the 112th Regiment of the 28th Division. As they fell back, they were put into that perimeter to try to hold the Germans off. The Germans did not get through there till the 23rd of December. At that time, Colonel Riggs broke his men up into small units to try to escape. He gave each one of them a map to try to get to the west if they could, but they all were captured. Colonel Riggs was marched into Germany, and he lost some 50 pounds of weight. He was a big man, played football in his college days. He was later put in a prison camp in Poland. He was liberated by the underground, and the Russians finally got him and sent him back to I think the Black Sea, where he was flown by American aircraft to Egypt and eventually rejoined the division. But the rest of the division that had withdrawn at that time was scattered. Different units were different places. Frank was captured at a little place called Brac de Ferture. But the rest of us that reached the Meuse River traveled north then to a place called Mons, which was south of Liège a little bit. And it was there that a buzz bomb came over and hit right near our CP and almost destroyed it. There again, that's a nerving thing to have one of those big shells hit it. Dug a crater about 10 foot deep. That's a picture of St. Vith from the air after the attack. You can see the mountains in the distance there where the defensive areas were. And
you said this was taken by our reconnaissance after the Germans?
After the battle, yeah. Most of that damage was done by the Air Force. They bombed St. Vith on the 25th, which was Christmas. The cloud cover lifted and the Air Force was able to strafe all of the German columns who never reached their objective. They never got to the Meuse River, and they ended up having to abandon their vehicles because they ran out of fuel and ammunition, and they tried to make it back by foot. A lot of them got through, a lot of them didn't. but the Germans lost all of their armored weapons during that retreat. The 106th Division did participate in retaking parts of the area that it had lost. That didn't occur till late in January. After that, we were pulled back to reorganize and to have our replacements sent to us, which consisted mostly of Air Force personnel and people from various ASTP units, many of which had never fired a rifle. Fortunately, though, when we moved back into Germany, we crossed the river on a pontoon bridge at Koblenz and proceeded from there to a tributary of the Rhine River, which was called the Lahn River, to a place in the mountains, and it was called Bad Ems. From that day on, our division was busy building PW enclosures for the large number of German troops had surrendered in the Ruhr pocket by that time, and I think I've included that in a previous talk, so I won't go into it. We built these fields and herded the Germans in by the tens of thousands and put machine gun nests at the four corners and left them there to fend for themselves best they could. The food we gave them wasn't much. That sort of ends my talk to that period. I was sent back to the United States by way of Prestwick, Scotland, and I left on an airplane there and returned. We flew over Iceland and Greenland and landed in New Jersey. I was discharged in December of 1945, Camp Atterbury, Indiana, where we had trained after the division finished Tennessee maneuvers. I stayed in the reserve till after the Korean War ended, and that was the end of my war.